Hey internets, it's time for a slightly less political video than I usually do. And the reason I say slightly is that while this video is definitely going to be a bad game design tier list, focusing on a lot of general mistakes that new or even current devs tend to make, I'm also going to be going into a lot of the problems caused by the current weirdos that are currently in charge of the gaming industry at large. And so some of this is going to be a follow-up to a video I did on how neo-Marxists managed to kinda hijack the gaming industry, to the point where some devs would rather focus on making sure their game is a woke circle jerk than, actually making a good game. But on the other hand, a lot of this stuff is going to be focused on mechanics and some lesser known mistakes that devs tend to make. Because one lesser known fact about me is I've actually worked in the gaming industry before as QA, as a programmer, and as a 3D artist. And I have seen so many studios and so many indie devs just make utterly ridiculous errors that could be easily avoided if they just understood certain things. Also, there's no sponsor for this one, however, I am putting all of my gaming-related merch on a nice limited time sale for my merch store, including a new item. Gamers Rise Up is now available as a mug, and at a temporary introductory sale price. A link for all this good stuff will be in the description below, and all the profits do indeed go towards helping me make more content, as I do indeed need to be able to buy food, otherwise that would eventually get in the way of me being able to make videos. Anyways, the way this tier list is going to work is that all of these things that are general game dev mistakes in some way or another, but some of them aren't as bad as another. And so the problems that are arguably not that bad, and some gamers even probably appreciate it, those go into B tier. Yep, that's right, there's no A or S tier in this. It shall top out at B. Everything here at least sucks that much. In addition to topping out at B, we will not be bottoming out at F tier. Instead, we have a nice pit of hell tier. Whereas if any aspiring devs make this mistake, then you can be rest assured that I shall be feasting on the souls of your children's 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 children. And speaking of pit of hell tier, let's start out with one that goes directly into that pit. The Infantilizing tutorial. Please, devs, stop doing this. Where you start the game, and instead of starting out in actual gameplay, you find yourself and the character in some gray box area with no enemies or goals, so to speak. This is where you have that tutorial in the game where it tells you to move the analog stick to the left to move your character left. You did it. Good boy. Now move your analog stick forward to move your character forward. Good boy. You get a gold star. Now move your analog stick. Yeah, you get the point. Some devs, for whatever completely insane reason, get this idea into their head that they need to design their game with a tutorial in it that assumes the person playing it has never played a game before and has no idea what a gamepad is, as well as having the mental faculties of your average toddler. Despite the fact that in the year 2025, the gamepad honestly hasn't really changed that much in the last 20 years. Every gamer knows how to use the freaking gamepad. It is such a massive waste of time, and really unfortunate because there's actually better ways to do this. For example, Mario 1-1. Yeah, all the way back into the Nintendo days. What's interesting about Mario 1-1 is that it is specifically designed to teach the player how to play the game without telling them. For instance, it starts Mario off on a flat plane with a Goomba slowly moving towards him. In order to advance, the player has to press buttons, and they'll quickly find out what the buttons do. Pressing the D-pad left or right moves Mario left or right, but also they have a limited time to figure out the jump button. And then it goes on from there. Areas of the level where you have to learn how to run jump. Areas of the level that will teach you how to hit blocks and how to stomp enemies, without explicitly telling the player. Now, granted, controls are a little bit more complicated these days. For instance, if you are playing a new action game as a gamer who's used gamepads before many times, you don't immediately know which button they've assigned to the attack button. And so a better way to do this these days is to have a level that includes captions on the controls, but lets the player use them in an actual level. Like, for instance, start the game out with an enemy in front of the player, and then maybe subtitle captions on how to attack and do certain combos. That is the absolute most you need. Skip the gray box area. It is stupid. The only exception to this is if you've genuinely designed a game with genuinely unique mechanics. Which, let's be honest for a moment, you probably haven't. Most devs are making the exact same slop as the other devs. We all know this. So yeah, bit of hell tier, moving on to something slightly related, which is the Unskippable tutorial. Which, by the way, if you are a dev who has committed both of these cardinal sins, if you have created the Infantilizing tutorial and it can't be skipped, then I immediately want to uninstall your game. However, I will put this in F tier, because again, there's some times that you might have a genuinely unique mechanic, and it's best to inform gamers on that. Like one recent game I checked out was Strenova, which has a mechanic where you turn 2D and walk along the walls. Yeah, if you have something like that, sure, I can understand why you'd want to make the tutorial and make it a little bit unskippable. Otherwise, the player is going to miss out on a very critical mechanic. But the thing is, you can always just make the tutorial replayable if the player decides to skip it at first. So there's no real reason to make it unskippable. Rather, instead, it's better just make it as an available option. But anyways, moving on to equity balancing. Now, some people call this different things, like some people will call this scrub pandering, some people will call this noob pandering, but it's all effectively the same thing. I prefer to call it equity balancing, because what this problem is it's when you balance your game in a way that doesn't actually balance the game, but instead is aimed to just reduce the gap between highly skilled and lesser skilled players. A good example of this is something I saw in Guild Wars recently, where they did a balance update where they changed the Mesmer trait power block so that instead of putting the skills that you interrupt on an extra cooldown, it instead gives the Mesmer a damage bonus when they manage to interrupt a skill. And to put this in perspective to people who've never played Guild Wars before, this was neither a buff nor was it a nerf. Power block is still just as good as a trait as it always was. The difference though comes down to the player skill of the Mesmer. Previously, when power block put the skill it interrupted on an additional cooldown, it was a trait that significantly rewarded good Mesmer players for interrupting key skills, like interrupting an enemy healing skill. Whereas mediocre Mesmer players, they have a bit harder time telling what skills are being cast. And so ArenaNet changed it so that it can interrupt any skill, which means it doesn't actually matter as much anymore on what the Mesmer is actually interrupting, which means that it's both a nerf and a buff targeted at different types of players. It was a nerf to higher skilled Mesmer players, while being a buff to more mediocre Mesmers who would just rather spam interrupts randomly in hopes that they interrupt something. And that's what this change of power block was meant to pander to. So it was entirely done to reduce the gap in skill between button mashers and competent players. Or another example of this is in a game that has certain divisions and tiers like silver, bronze, gold, platinum, diamond, etc. I still see devs of really highly successful games making the mistake of balancing their game around gold, rather than balancing it for the higher tiers. And the reason this is a mistake is because any game, over time, players tend to become more skilled. And I don't just mean individual players, but I mean the players as a group. If you look at any game, like even a board game like Go or chess or anything like that, you'll see that players have actually become more skilled each generation. And the same thing happens in online multiplayer games. People in the higher tiers will find some kind of mechanic to exploit, find some new strategy, and then that strategy will eventually make its way down to the lower tiers. And what this means is that if you try to balance around gold, well, you're kind of chasing the dragon. By the time your dev team is finished implementing that balance patch, which can take a few months or so, the gold division may already be dealing with something that's actually was originally in the platinum or diamond division. So they end up balancing around a problem that doesn't even exist anymore, and often these changes make things worse in the higher divisions, which will then of course come down into the lower divisions. And that's kind of how it happens with this balance philosophy centered around making players more equal instead of making the game more fair. And that's why I call it equity balancing. And yes, there's definitely a noticeable increase in this type of balancing in recent years, as woke weirdos have influenced the ranks. That may just be a coincidence, or maybe it's not. But anyways, despite what I've just said, I'm actually going to put this in C tier. Because the thing is, a lot of gamers, they don't really care about the esports crap, they're just playing to have fun. Equity balancing isn't a good balance philosophy, but I can understand why they do it. When I was younger, I might have put this a bit lower. Because of my older age, I don't have as much time to really get into certain games. But it is a problem, and I notice it more and more and more. Anyways, next up is no level design. Or another word I could potentially use for this is 3D slop. There's a pretty big problem in gaming these days, especially with pretty much most of all games being 3D games, is that there's a lot of devs who make the mistake of thinking that level design equals environmental art. No, that's not what level design is. There's so many 3D action games I see now, where if you think about it logically, it's really nothing more than just kind of a flat space to walk around in, with linear progression and no no real obstacles whatsoever. So a lot of games focus a bit more on combat mechanics rather than making an interesting environment. And while that's all well and good, because some games that do this actually are still good games. Like for example, Zone of the Enders commits this crime, and Zone of the Enders is a fantastic game. But that's because the combat in Zone of the Enders is really, really, really good, so it can kinda get away with this sort of linear, simple level design, because it makes up for it with interesting boss design. But still, I'm pretty sure most gamers would prefer that devs look a little bit more at the old days. Back when games were 2D, you really had to think about level design in order to make the game interesting. You had to give each level unique obstacles to keep players engaged. Because, you know, one of the simplest ways to make a game quote-unquote fun is to make sure it's not repetitive. Make sure gamers are given iteration. And I think devs have made this mistake over the years where they put too much focus on what the character can do in 3D space, but not enough focus on that actual 3D space. And so they craft worlds that look interesting, but they're only interesting on the surface. Each level ends up being exactly the same. But again, since you can get away with it if the rest of the mechanics of the game are good enough, I'm gonna put it in C tier. It's bad, it's not good, and I think there's a lot of untapped potential in terms of level design these days. But again, there's a reason why people have kind of forgotten about how to do level design, because it's not as completely necessary in 3D games as 2D games. But anyways, next up is the first problem where we're really getting into the issue with woke toids infesting the industry. Writer self-inserts. There's hundreds of other videos you could probably find on YouTube where somebody rants about just this problem alone. And it's sad because I don't think the devs who do this realize just how obvious it is to us gamers when they do this. When you have your little blue-haired, gender non-conforming they-them character do something that would ordinarily be incredibly stupid and reckless, but then having them get out of it by having plot armor, in a pathetic example of an everyone on the bus clapped scenario, your game is just immediately automatically bad in terms of story. And if story is one of the big focuses of your game, then guess what? Your entire game sucks. Because the story isn't believable anymore. That's the problem with Mary Sue self-inserts. You know that the writer isn't actually invested in trying to make an interesting world for the player to experience, but is instead just the writer injecting their narcissism into a character which they then live vicariously through. This is pretty much always bad writing. Pit of hell tier. And speaking of woke scolding, let's go into woke story next. You know, if I had to say the difference between bad Eastern developers when it comes to writing a story for their game and bad Western developers, the main difference is that bad Eastern devs, so like China and South Korea, what they will do is they'll just write an extremely generic story. They will blatantly try to rip off a more popular story. You see this in anime with isekai slop all the time. One writer makes a really good story, and then the amateurs try to reproduce it. And that can definitely happen in the Western game dev scene, but there's a slight difference, which is that because the woke scolds have injected themselves so far into the gaming sphere, mainly with their power and influence within gaming journalism, what Western story writers in the gaming industry will do is they'll just hide their lack of talent by making their story about lay equality and about how lay tabula is lay rasa. Equality feel good, therefore equality real. Oh look, and lay enemy is a stand-in for lay bad mustache man. And so they pad their story to the top with as much establishment virtue signaling as they can possibly cram in, and that way they make their plot immune from criticism. They get all the game journos clapping about how diverse and inclusive their story is, and how it's an allegory for systemic oppression that exists today. Lay strong and brave liberal versus Lay Nutsi's unoriginal and contrived plot, number 600,942. And so we've seen the game dev industry adopt this kind of Oscar baiting, but for game journalists instead of the Oscars. This obvious padding and pandering so that the official critics will give your game a higher score than it deserves. That being said, I'm going to put this in D tier, because if the rest of the game is good, then you can kinda get away with it. I can definitely understand why a game dev that just wants to make a good game but doesn't really care about the story might wokeify their story so that way game journals will give it a higher score. I mean, it's very stupid, but very understandable at the same time, so I give it D tier. And also because gamers who are brainwashed trash libs themselves who have no understanding of woke ideology, or someone who is otherwise politically ignorant, they might not even notice this problem with the story. They may not even realize how contrived and unoriginal it is. Anyways, next up is overvaluing realism. You know know when it comes to game design, someone doesn't know what they're talking about when they say that a mechanic is good because it's more realistic. Gamers are not playing a game because they care about realism. There is absolutely nothing realistic about the hero that the player controls suddenly gaining magic powers and then going on a quest to fight eldritch beings from the void. There's no realism in gaming whatsoever. But that being said, I put it in B tier because there is some need for believability. For instance, that's why gamers tend to like games where the main character has a big giant sword, because we're all familiar with big giant sword, and swinging big giant sword happened to be fun. Krug swing giant sword at monster. Giant monster dies. Brain dopamine released. Monkey neuron activated. So there's some need for relatability here. But again, it's important for game devs to understand that it's not necessary in all aspects. It is, at best, a small bonus, but in many cases it's a distraction and waste of game dev resources and time. So yeah, again, B tier. Moving on. Next is game systems patenting. The utter cringe and evil that is software patents when it comes to the game industry. And yes, those of you with a keen eye might notice that the picture I'm using for this is indeed the Nemesis system. That patented game system where NPCs themselves have progression depending on how the player interacts with those NPCs. Software patents are pretty much always stupid, and for a lot more reasons than just the usual libertarian argument that I might give, that intellectual property is not a scarce resource. Oh no, in this case, that doesn't matter. Software patents would still suck, even if you completely ignored libertarian philosophy. Because all it does is kill innovation and prevent people from taking the idea and implementing it in new games with even better systems. And it's not even that original. I mean, come on, NPC progression and hierarchy based on player interaction? I came up with something relatively the same as the Nemesis system back when I was 10 years old in the 1990s. It's just that gaming hardware wasn't good enough to make it a reality until the 2010s. And so really the only thing that Warner Brothers did was they managed to be the first big corporation to implement this idea while having the funds to shove their way into the patent office. It's very, very stupid. Straight to pit of hell tier. Moving on. Next up is idiot proofing the first 30 minutes of the game. This is a problem I have with newer games versus retro games, and it's why I often find myself firing up RetroArch and playing some old game instead of some new, shiny, released in the last 2 years game I got off Steam on sale or something. Yes, I, unfortunately, like many gamers, am guilty of the Steam library backlog. But anyways, the point is that a really good thing about a lot of retro games is that they're challenging within the first 10 seconds of the game. Like Contra, for example, you have to pay attention to the buttons you're pressing pretty much immediately on the first level. And this is a big problem that I think has been lost over the years as gradual casualization of gaming has gone on and on. Where in a lot of new games, the first 30 minutes or so of the game, you can legit just button mash and face tank all of the enemies. It's gotten so bad that the games that don't do this, we've actually called them a genre, where you have a game where enemies have animations and you have to actually pay attention to them pretty much immediately. We now call that a Souls-like game because of Dark Souls, as if Dark Souls somehow invented this kind of difficulty, when in reality this is just how gaming used to be. It used to be that you could just start up just about any game on either Super Nintendo, Genesis, NES, or whatever, and it's actually possible to die on the first level. Novel concept, apparently. And maybe this is just a personal pet peeve, but personally I look at it as if there's no challenge whatsoever, most of the time it's not really fun. It ends up making the game feel more like a movie rather than, you know, a game that you're playing for, you know, the gameplay. But as for rating, I kind of look at this somewhat similar to the Unskippable tutorial, but I'll give it a C simply because some of these games at least have a hard mode, so it's slightly less brain dead, and oftentimes with newer modern games, the rest of the game afterwards is good. They just wanted to make sure that gamers learned the mechanics of their game. But still, it is pretty annoying that so many modern games basically treat you like you're a complete moron for the first half hour. I put it in D tier. And also, moving on next to something that's slightly related to this, it's now time to talk about noobification, or just the gradual casualization of video gaming. Which again, I cannot help but notice the pattern of more and more neo-Marxists in the industry and more casualization, where a very simple way to make the gamers more equal and to make all games a safe space is to make it so that all the monsters on all the first few levels only deal 1 damage per second to you while you have 1,000 health. And you know, people tend to blame mobile gaming for this often. That's the usual scapegoat, mobile gaming, but it's really something that's been going on since the early 2000s. Mobile games just made it worse worse because of how mobile games control. I'll get into that a little bit later. But really, the easification or casualization of games, it's definitely annoying, but it's not completely awful. Because this one, I do have to admit there's a bit of a financial incentive in it, because if games appeal to a wider audience, then of course game devs will make more money. The problem though is that making a game really easy is also often just a way for a clueless game dev to hide their lack of game design talent. A truly well-made game can be difficult but still appeal to a wide audience by doing things in the game that make it easy to understand. Again, side note, study Mario 1-1. There's a lot to that level. Any game dev that knows what they're doing can make difficulty a positive experience. However, I will mercifully put this in C tier because a lot of people don't really care about it. So I'll move on. Next to virtue signaling. Look at how strong and brave we are for holding the same opinions as 99% of the rest of Western trash lib media. It's very stupid and very blatantly obvious when game devs do this, just to pander to game journoids, just so that they'll give your game a slightly higher score and slightly higher publicity. But here's the thing, gamers are freaking tired of it. Any of us with an ounce of critical thinking skills knows that what game journos say means effectively nothing, and that's at best. I mean, game journalism is so corrupt and hasn't learned anything from the Gamergate days that most of us gamers are better off assuming that the opposite of whatever they say is true. And so when you include virtue signaling in your game to pander to those people, it's actually not really helping you. But again, I shall be merciful and put this in C tier, simply because it doesn't automatically make the game bad. As long as devs make sure that virtue signaling is not the central theme of their story, complete with unskippable cutscenes, then you can kinda get away with this. Personally, I don't buy games that do this because there's plenty of other games that don't, and I would advise most people to not buy games that do this. However, I will be honest and admit that from a gameplay and game mechanic perspective, it doesn't automatically send a game to trash heap. It just means, in my opinion, that gamers probably shouldn't be giving this developer money. But anyways, let's move on to something that's a bit more on the mechanic side. Engagement optimized matchmaking. This is where you have some kind of online multiplayer versus player game where the matchmaking takes not so much player skill into account, but rather player engagement into account in order to ensure that every player enjoys some level of wins. It's kind of like that Simpsons episode where they have musical chairs where there's more chairs than kids. So that way every kid can feel like they're a winner. Except in engagement optimized matchmaking, it gives everybody a chance to feel like the winner. Not necessarily every time though, because of course that's impossible. This I will just put in D tier because it depends on how much engagement optimized matchmaking they're doing. It's possible for there to be some EOM in an otherwise mostly skill-based matchmaking system and for them to kind of get away with it. But usually it just results in bad games. So I put it in D tier. Anyways, next up is gacha mechanics. And a lot of people are going to disagree with me on this one, but I'm going to put it in B tier. Because honestly, there's nothing wrong with receiving random items from randomization loot boxes, or having random characters or random item pulls. I mean, things like that have honestly existed in RPG games since the 90s. The real problem comes down to how gacha games are often monetized, which I'll cover a bit later. But the actual mechanic of gacha, people need to stop looking at gacha as something that's bad, just automatically from it existing. Because the actual act of receiving random items, if you think about it, it exists everywhere. Your real beef is with the next problem, and that is the free-to-play paradox. You see, the problem that every dev has when it comes to deciding to make their game free-to-play is that you have to get gamers to spend something on the game, which means that the game inherently has to lack in something. And so this puts devs in a situation where they're incentivized to intentionally design flaws in the game and then sell players the solution to their flawed game. Yeah, and this is why so many free-to-play games have so many negative reviews. I think what devs don't understand is that in order for free-to-play games to make it, then two things need to be true. The first thing is that the game actually needs to be significantly better than the average game, because you're intentionally designing it with flaws and then selling the players, aka your customers, the solution. And so if you do something like, say, putting a time gate in your game and then selling players a way to skip that time gate, well, that's actually almost always an example of bad game design. And admittedly, I understand that Chinese devs kinda have to do this because of regulations in China, but for global releases, it's best to leave it out. Because the thing is, no buy-to-play game does that to players. Telling them, okay, you're done now unless you play, when someone was planning on having a Friday night gaming session, well, what a lot of times they'll do is they'll just uninstall your game and then go play something else. So when you have a free-to-play game, you have to make sure that those flaws aren't complete and total flaws. And I don't think devs really quite get this. So I'm going to put this in F tier because it has the gaming industry in a really bad spot right now. And I'll talk a bit more about this a little bit later in the tier list, but let's move on to something a little bit more fun, but also very cancerous, and that is woke puritanism. tokenism. I did a quick rant on this a while ago. This is where game devs censor sexuality in the game, or when game journalists call for censorship, specifically when that sexuality is in favor of the evil straight white male. So for instance, supposed liberals who, aren't supposed to care about what other people do in the bedroom, suddenly whining about how Stellar Blade is problematic because the lead female character is conventionally attractive. Oh no, the horror. This is of course very stupid, and it's been pretty much proven at this point that chastising people for what they find attractive doesn't work. You cannot tell men to stop finding big boobs attractive for the same reason you cannot tell women to stop finding tallness attractive. It kinda all harkens back to the problem of woke-toids taking over the industry because, woke-toids, a big part of their ideology is believing in tabula rasa or the blank state, even though tabula rasa has been debunked. So they think that they can somehow manipulate people into being attracted to different things, even though that's steaming low to hooey. And of course, a lot of times it's just them hating on the straight white evil male. However, I'm actually just going to put it in D tier instead of pit of hell tier, because as much as we want to see it down there, censorship itself, where they'll take a character from some Eastern game that has very big boobies that are just kind of hanging out there, well, yeah, when you understand that they just do that because they don't like straight white men, then it is pretty annoying. However, it doesn't necessarily change anything about the gameplay. It's just kind of stupid. But let's get back to the other topic. Next up is talking about microtransactions. This is actually another one that is going to surprise people and have some people pretty strongly disagree with me. I'm going to put it in B tier, and here's why. Microtransactions are only annoying when the total cost to actually have a game that is somewhat feeling like it's complete and somewhat fun is more expensive than just an actual average buy to play game. Yes, you could argue that it is predatory, but the thing is that's still people deciding to do with their money what they desire. I personally think this is a case of people blaming game devs for their own lack of self-control. In most cases, the microtransaction is something you really don't need. It's only a problem when you have someone who doesn't understand that the gems or opals or mystic coins or whatever are represented by actual real money that they are pulling from their credit card. And the thing is, that is the gamer's fault. However, again, I can understand why people don't like it. That's again why this tier list caps out at B tier. B tier doesn't mean it's good, it just means it's not that bad. You are totally capable of ignoring the microtransaction. You do not need the shiny hat of green glowiness with a mystical feather on top. You just want it. And if you pay for it with real money, well, that's on you, not the game dev. Microtransactions are honestly only an issue when paired with the next problem on this tier list. So let's move on to the real issue, which is whale monetization. This is the actual problem with many free-to-play games and many live service model games, or whatever game that has some kind of in-game store, which unfortunately is pretty much all games these days. I mean, even freaking buy-to-play games have in-game stores now. But the real issue comes down to a common thing that mostly is an issue with the free-to-play games, and that is whale monetization. This is where the microtransactions or the economy of an online game is deliberately designed around encouraging certain players to spend as much money as possible, based around the statistical reality that most of the game money being spent is actually being done by a very small minority of gamers. And many devs, especially devs working under major publishers, have noticed this statistic and have been designing their monetization schemes directly for the whales. And the issue with doing this is that it pretty much always dooms your game. Gamers are learning more and more that when we see whale monetization, what we're really seeing is a game that will not last. We're seeing a game that is a cash grab that will be taken offline in a maximum of 5 years, probably even sooner than that. Because the problem with whale monetization is that it doesn't give non-whales a way to enjoy the game. Any dev of a live service online multiplayer game that wants their MMORPG or whatever to survive more than 5 years, well, they understand the mantra that players are content. One of the biggest reasons that people play a multiplayer game is because it is a multiplayer game, which means, there's other players in the game to play and interact with. And so game developers who actually want their game to last the test of time, they will want their game to support as many free players as possible, so that way the whales have players to play with. And so when your monetization scheme doesn't have anything for the free players and tries to paywall and time gate them at every single opportunity, well, that's not a game that's going to last the test of time. And we're reaching a point where I think most gamers are starting to recognize the pattern. When we see whale monetization, we know that this is a game that is dying on arrival. We know that it's a game that's not going to last. However, that all being said, I'm just going to barely spare it from pit of hell tier. Because as a libertarian capitalist, I understand from a making money perspective why devs who just want to earn a living will sometimes do this. However, a cash grab is still a cash grab, and from a gamer's perspective, this is absolute cancer. And so F tier it goes. And speaking of that, next up, let's just get pay to win out of the way. This is often pretty much the same thing as whale monetization, but with one difference. Because the thing is, on some ways, pay to win is kind of a buzzword that a lot of people just apply to every free-to-play game. So for the sake of understanding, I'm gonna define this as having items that affect game balance behind a paywall. The only reason I'm ranking this differently than whale monetization is because it's possible to have this without necessarily requiring whales, and not all whale monetization schemes have hard paywalls. A lot of them just have soft paywalls where you can still technically get the item, but if you grind for 10,000 hours. But no, I'm defining pay to win as it's completely paywall. There's no way to get it without spending money. So for example, the game doesn't have any kind of consignment system or trading house where players can trade in-game gold for the premium currency. I know some people still consider that pay to win if the grind is unrealistic, but I'm just going to define pay to win as hard paywalls that don't have that. This actually does go to pit of hell tier. And fortunately, I'm seeing a lot more games not doing hard paywalls like this. I usually only see it in mobile games still, but more and more PC games aren't doing this. And the reason is because it just isn't fun. A game isn't really free to play if one guy is running around with the golden AR and absolutely dominating the field with his pay to win gun instead of actually having skill. When you do this as a game dev, you're effectively just allowing paid cheaters. And that's why when I see a game that has a hard paywall, I just immediately don't play it. If I notice it, I won't install it. After installing it, if I see it, I will immediately uninstall. Because it is an instant tell that the game devs know that their game is not going to last. No free-to-play game with hard paywalls like this lasts the test of time. This actually does go to pit of hell tier. Next up is uglification. Once again, talking about problems of the woke-toids who are in the gaming industry. This is kind of just another spin on woke puritanism, except it's honestly even worse. It's when they intentionally make any of the female characters that, you know, the evil straight white male might find attractive, well, they take those characters and they make them intentionally ugly. And then they use arguments like it's for the sake of more realism or whatever. The thing is, it's actually worse than woke puritanism. Because now instead of just censoring the game, you know, like usually just censoring an Eastern game as it comes in, this is the devs actually doing this from the ground up to the game. And I'm going to put this in F tier because even though on its surface, it might not be a thing that you would think affects the gameplay, but actually, usually when a dev does this, it's a sign that the dev is completely insane. Making the female characters ugly just so that the evil straight white men can't enjoy the game. That is just the height of narcissism and woke envy. I'm sorry, but it's actually kind of hilariously stupid. It's so stupid that it's usually a sign that, honestly, the rest of the game probably isn't that good, because it's usually a sign that said game developer is, quite frankly, somewhat mentally disturbed. But anyways, moving on to something that is a bit more in-depth into game dev itself. And that is what I call vertical progression slop. Now, on its surface, vertical progression isn't necessarily a bad thing. In fact, in many ways, it's a good thing. Players feel good when they get that +1 sword, and then find that +2 sword, and then find that +3 golden sword, and then find that +5 dragon slaying sword. Even though the way the game mechanics works, it's the same item, it has the same skills, it does the same slashy slash thing. It still makes players feel good to get stronger and stronger items, even if they're the same item. However, there does come a point where it starts to get a little bit boring, especially when said vertical progression starts to make the rest of the game irrelevant. Because when you get that +1, then +2, +3, +5, +25 sword, and let's say it's a Metroidvania style game, well, when the player revisits the first parts of the game, that first initial area, probably already easy enough as it is now just mind-numbingly easy to the point where it feels like a grind, because you have these +100 armor and +100 sword, and so, you know, the enemies don't even do damage to you. You just plow right through them, which at first can seem a little bit fun, but it's also a bit monotonous. Better game design is where you include more variants. A mace, or a gun, or a hammer. That isn't necessarily better than the sword you start the game with, but has different skills and thus offers a different way to play the game. Sure, that does take more programming time because then you have to actually code in those different skills and make new 3D animations for them, but but the game is better overall when you do this. And I bring this up because it's an issue I see with game developers, especially in the modern day. It's really, really weird that there's only 2 horizontal progression MMORPGs in existence, really. I mean, there's more than just Guild Wars 2 and the Elder Scrolls, but they're usually just pet projects. And so, especially in the live service model where you're constantly offering updates, I think people are drastically underestimating the power of horizontal progression instead. In general, gamers like new experiences more than they like just gaining +1. This is actually kind of one of the reasons why Mario 3 back in the day was considered such an amazing game, because the power-ups it offered past a certain level were all side grades. It gave a lot of replayability because then Mario could then challenge the game in different levels in different ways. I mean, it's not the only reason why Mario 3 was considered a masterpiece. It's also one of the best in terms of level design, which I already went over, but you get the picture. However, I will put this in C tier because it's not necessarily something that will automatically make the game bad. It's just something that will often have the game showing signs of untapped potential. There are a lot of games out there that I've played or even tested that would have been so much better if the devs just took the time to add some horizontal variants. Anyways, next up is unskippable cutscenes. Here is the reality check. Your story may be good, but in all likelihood, it is not. Many players would rather just skip it. It is always better to let the player decide this, but I will put it in C tier because it's really only a minor annoyance. It's something easily forgivable if the rest of the game is good. And you know, sometimes the story is at least somewhat entertaining, but it's still bad and you shouldn't do it. It's another one of the problems of retro games versus new modern games. Modern games have a lot going for them due to, you know, more advanced hardware, but they also have this problem of unskippable cutscenes. And that's why I, just like so many other gamers, often find ourselves tempted to just go back to the Super Nintendo every now and then. Because sometimes we'd rather just have quick and easy entertainment than being forced to watch a movie when we wanted to play a video game. Again, C tier. Next up is mobile slop. Now, this is the actual problem of mobile gaming. What I mean by mobile slop is bad game design decisions that devs are kind of somewhat forced to make due to the limitations of smartphones and touchscreen controls. A really good example of this is a recent game I played, Crystal of Atlan. It is a PC and mobile game cross-platform MMO, which to its credit, it is one of the better ones I've ever played of this genre. In fact, it's pretty much the only cross-platform MMO that I found entertaining enough to get to max level. However, it is definitely guilty of some mobile slop. For example, pretty much every single MMO, even MMORPGs from way back in the day, be it old school classic World of Warcraft, EverQuest, or Guild Wars freaking 1, when you hold your mouse and you hover it over an item, a tooltip pops up showing you what that item is and giving you a basic rundown of what the item does. But in Crystal of Atlan, on the PC version, when you mouse over an item, it doesn't do this. You have to click and hold the item, and then it shows you the tooltip. Now, of course, for mobile gaming, this makes perfect sense because there is no mouse over on a phone. You just have your finger. So, of course, you would have to push and hold on an item, and that would be a good control as far as mobile phones go to be able to see a tooltip for an item. So in that regard, it makes total sense. But on the flip side, it is completely stupid for the PC version. And then, of course, there's just the fact that a lot of games are a lot more simplified these days because, again, they want to be cross-platform with, you know, PC and mobile. And so you end up with actually something that even more encourages vertical progression slop, because you can't really have a game with dozens of abilities at once available to you, like, say, for example, Final Fantasy XIV. There's just not enough space on a phone to fit buttons for a thumb, and just mobile controls in general suck. And so that's what mobile slop is, and I understand why devs do it, because the mobile market is a huge market, and mobile gamers tend to spend a lot of money. But on the PC side of things, it's definitely annoying, because it results in a lot of games having these really weird limitations and flaws that just never existed before. And so while I understand it from an economic perspective, the absolutely abysmal effect it has had on the actual gameplay just cannot be ignored. And so I must put it in F tier, with the only thing sparing it from the pit of hell being the fact that it has an economic boon to it. It has at least a reason behind it. I do not like that reason, and it is very bad for the game industry from the gamer's perspective, and that's why it goes to F tier, but I at least understand the reason. So again, F tier. Anyways, next up is localization slop. This is when localizers who are in charge of translating an Eastern game, usually from Chinese or Japanese or Korean, usually to English for a global market, and they decide to, change the dialogue to make it a little bit more in line with their politically correct beliefs. Yep, it is always stupid when they do this, and it is also a blatant abuse of intellectual property laws when they try to get mods that fix their stupidity banned. Absolute pit of hell tier. Next up is not being able to edit the controls. Now, if the game is genuinely unique and needs a way for certain controls to be a certain way, then this is slightly understandable, which spares it from F and pit of hell tier. But in reality, especially from a PC gamer side, most of the time when you make it so that we can't edit controls, all you're really doing is forcing us to set up a macro profile for your specific game, and thus making us waste our time circumventing the restriction at the OS level. And let's be honest, in most cases, this is just developer laziness. D tier. Now, next up is clunkiness. So, when it comes to actual gameplay mechanics, what makes a game good? What makes a game fun? What makes the world tick? What again gets the dopamine going, gets the monkey neuron activated? I think good gameplay is something that everybody kind of understands, but it's really difficult to define and explain. And the reason for that is that it's actually easier to explain it by explaining what it isn't, which is that good gameplay isn't clunky. The entire point of a video game is that you have something responding to player input. And so when those responses are slow and do not feel smooth, when it feels like the input doesn't really do much to what's happening on screen, the result is something that just isn't satisfying. And this is something where you could write an entire book series on, something that you could devote an entire new YouTube channel to if you wanted to. But I will just simplify it as this. If when you have the QA team run the game locally, and they often feel as if they are lagging, even though they're effectively playing on zero ping because, it's local, when QA reports something like that, then there's a good chance that there's something very wrong with your core gameplay that needs to be reevaluated. Either the controls, how the player moves, how fast the player moves, animation speed, enemy interaction. If something feels off to QA, to the point where if the QA team at any point describes it as feeling like they're lagging, even though they're not, then something is very wrong. And this is very important because I've seen in some game dev circles when they run into this problem, when they QA test the game and something just kind of feels laggy, just doesn't feel fun, devs will make the critical mistake of, instead of fixing the gameplay, they just make things easier. They cover up the bad game design with making it impossible to lose. So that way the casuals feel good about themselves. And the reality is casuals will move on to the next game. But anyways, I give it a D tier, and only because it's legitimately difficult to spot and understand. Which, speaking of lag, next up is no netcode. Another very common problem in online multiplayer games. Please always make sure you hire programmers who understand netcode. I have seen so many games committing just basic mistakes, like for example not having skill queuing in an online game, resulting in really stupid weird things like player attack speed or player gun firing speed being limited by the player's latency because the game logic can't understand that the player's holding the button down. Very stupid when this happens, very embarrassing. Please, game devs, make sure that if you're making an online multiplayer game, that one of the lead programmers understands netcode. And this one goes to F tier. Ignoring the problem of lag can absolutely kill your game. Next up is tokenism or diversity slop, which is where they make the character cast diverse to appease the woketoids. This one goes to D tier. I mean, the only real issue behind it is that the reasoning it uses is false. When people are asked if they want representation, they'll often say that they want representation. But the problem is what people say that they want doesn't necessarily match what they actually show that they want in practice. In reality, Dragon Ball Z has proven that diversity doesn't really matter that much at all. People say that they care, but they don't. Anyway, this goes to D tier simply because it doesn't automatically make the game bad. It's just annoying and also often a sign that the devs behind the game don't really know what they're doing. So while it doesn't automatically deduct from gameplay, in reality it kind of does deduct from gameplay, because the devs that do this are most likely going to be making more mistakes than just making diversity slop. Again, D tier. Now, next up is something a bit more in-depth, and that is talking about extreme punishing in games. So for example, retro games where you had one life, and if you died, you have to start all the way back at the beginning. Of course, most of the time it wasn't just one life, maybe you had 3 lives, but then, you had to start back at the beginning. It's actually actually kind of interesting. A lot of retro games are significantly harder to beat, even though it only takes an hour or so to beat them, simply because they're much, much more punishing. It was a way for the games to kind of artificially increase the gameplay time, because you genuinely had to, get good at the game. It's why sometimes I like to call it the get good era of gaming, in order to, actually beat the game. And some people might be noticing that I have included a picture of Ghosts and Goblins for this one. And here's the thing, Ghosts and Goblins is actually being here as an example of a game that isn't that punishing. And yes, I know that's a little bit weird to say that, because if you're familiar with Ghosts and Goblins, then you're familiar with the fact that it's considered one of the hardest, if not the hardest games on the NES. I mean, I remember beating this game when I was 6 or 7 years old or something. I actually have the NES cartridge still from my old days buried somewhere in one of my boxes. But of course, it took me somewhere around 200, 300 deaths. However, there was one thing about Ghosts and Goblins that I really liked that let my child self ignore the fact that it was really, really hard, which is that it wasn't totally punishing. Ghosts and Goblins was actually very progressive as a game in that it was one of the only games at the time that gave you infinite continues. Once you beat a level, you beat that level. It was really freaking hard to beat those levels, but you beat it. You can try over and over again. I recall when I actually finally beat the game, I actually had to leave the NES on for a while and then come back to it after eating dinner, die another 50 times and then finally beat it. But it had infinite continues. It didn't send you back to freaking level 1 when you ran out of lives at the last stage. And I bring Ghosts and Goblins up as an example because it shows that you can make a game hard without necessarily making it punishing. Another game that comes to mind that understood this was the Mega Man series. Another one of my favorites next to Ghosts and Goblins. Again, infinite continues. Now, fortunately, games these days don't really make this mistake anymore. In fact, they make the opposite mistake and make games pretty much unlosable, which I'll get into soon. However, I just need to bring this up as just kind of a point in gaming history and how difficulty has evolved over the years. Some people, on the other hand, love punishing games. That's why some games like, say, Ori and the Blind Forest have things like a one life mode. For those crazy people actually enjoy that. But yeah, overall, it's an interesting piece of gaming history to understand about difficulty and how to put it in games. I put it in C tier. But anyways, next up is the actual problem, and that is making the game completely not punishing at all. Checkpoint, 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 instant revive, you legitimately cannot lose. Again, the picture in my mind of the musical chairs where it has more chairs than children. I mean, I guess some people like it when they just legitimately cannot lose, but let's be honest here, from a serious gamer perspective, this is total schlop. This is why I think that all modern games need to have hard modes unlocked from the start and not require you to beat the game on its normal mode, because way too many games these days, their normal mode is just mind-numbingly easy. Maybe this is just because I'm an older gamer, and so I'm used to just about everything they can throw at me, but I mean, holy crap, if the game is just going to start you off maybe 2 minutes before where you died whenever you fail, I mean, you might as well just play it on the hardest mode to begin with. But as annoying as it is to me, I'm going to put it in D tier, simply because I can, again, understand it from an economics perspective and appealing to the large casual audience perspective, and just the psychological reality that people don't like to feel like losers. But on a flip side, on the realistic side, the state of gaming difficulty these days is total cringe. Again, I find it completely bizarre that we now have a genre called Souls-like for games where you actually have to dodge enemy attacks. That it actually got so bad in terms of casualization that we forgot that this is just how games used to always be. And so then Dark Souls comes out and does what every retro game had already been doing, and gamers are like, oh wow, an actual difficult game, this is revolutionary. It's like the Zoomer version of Halo invented FPS. So yeah, moving on to the live service model. Oh boy. You know what? This is another one where people are gonna heavily disagree with me. I'm gonna put it in B tier. Because here's the thing, there's nothing wrong with a game constantly updating and giving people new stuff. I mean, that should be seen as a good thing. The problem isn't the live service model. The problem is all the monetization and whale schlop and free-to-play schlop and pay-to-win schlop that often comes with it. The actual model itself, though, well, there's nothing really wrong with it. Like, for instance, when you have a live service game where a lot of the updates are actually free, then live service is actually awesome, especially if you really like that game. Like, for example, 30XX often has updates. And while some of them had some paywalls behind them, overall, I like it when a game that I enjoy is still receiving developer attention. I mean, really, the live service model isn't much different than from back in the old day where the games would just have sequel after sequel after sequel. Mega Man 1, Mega Man 2, Mega Man 3, Mega Man 4, Mega Man 5, Mega Man 6. Because, of course, you couldn't just send updates to the NES console and update the NES cartridge that way back then. the technology didn't exist. And so in many ways, the live service model is just a way to replace more frequent sequels. It's again only really bad when mixed with more predatory monetization schemes. So yeah, B tier. Potentially D, F, or pit of hell tier, but only when it's paired with another problem that is in that tier. Next up is another thing where we kinda have to bash on the woketoids who kinda wormed their way into the industry, and that is bad community priorities. And I mean emphasis on community priorities, because just about every single game dev mistake, or really just every single business mistake in general, that can be summarized as bad priorities all the time. Oh, hey, Frederick, why didn't we meet our sales goal last month? Well, because we had bad priorities. And just say bad priorities and you'll pretty much always be right in terms of why things went wrong, to some degree. No, by this I specifically mean is this issue I see in online games that have a chat system where, because you have woketoids in charge of the game, and people with certain San Francisco sensibilities in your game master position, I see them committing this grave mistake of where they put more effort into moderating the chat box than into moderating the people who cause actual objective problems in the game, such as griefers, AFKers, or botters, hackers, cheaters, etc. And so more man hours is being put into banning the gamers who say a mean word, instead of banning botters who are ruining the in-game economy, or banning AFKers in the PvP arenas who are constantly ruining games for both sides. And this is always terrible priorities, because all you have to do to really fix the chat box is give gamers an option to mute players that they find annoying. Let the gamers themselves mostly moderate the chat box. This doesn't mean you shouldn't ban someone who's just absolutely 24/7 toxic, but when your GMs make it the focus in order to make the game a more safe and inclusive safe space, when they really should be going out fixing real problems, well, the result of that is that those real problems never get addressed. I have legitimately seen cases in a match where you had a hacker flying around the map in a game that of course has no flying ability whatsoever, and then insta-killing people with an ability that doesn't actually exist in the game, it was just hacked in, and then another player called the hacker a meanie no-no word, and then the player who said the bad word got banned by the GM, and the hacker didn't. And again, I think this is another problem that stems by woketoids gaining foothold in the industry, because those people tend to believe in, again, tabula rasa, that you can fix people, but the reality is gamers can't be fixed. Gamers are going to be like epic trash talk memesters for as long as gamers exist. And trying to fix it, especially when you're putting more effort into fixing it than, again, fixing the real problems, that is just shy of pit of hell tier. I put it in F tier simply because often the game itself is good, it's just the mods who suck. Anyway, next up is random slop, which this is just kind of the gradual increase of randomness in gaming mechanics I've seen over the years. Like for example, Team Fortress 2. When I first saw critical hits in Team Fortress 2, that was a radical increase to random luck in a first-person shooter back in those days. And the funny thing is that in terms of history, Team Fortress 2 is actually now more or less considered a more hardcore old-school first-person shooter, because the randomness has gotten even higher. Like for example, if you compare an old-school first-person shooter like Quake 2 to a more new-school random first-person shooter, especially a free-to-play one, you will notice a massive change in bullet spread. Bullet spread in modern gaming is way randomized compared to how it used to be. In fact, in the old days, some bullet spreads were intentionally not random. They would always fire the same amount in the same direction, or just fire perfectly straight, which isn't very realistic. However, it's a form of casualization. Increasing randomness in a game is kind of a way of doing equity balancing. It's just another way to reduce the gap between highly skilled players and lesser skilled players. However, I give it C tier simply because a lot of gamers don't really mind it. I mean, obviously, modern gamers are playing those modern FPS games anyways. Personally, I think a first-person shooter where you can't fire from the hip is automatically garbage, but that's just my personal taste. That one, I just kind of accept the fact that I'm a bit of a boomer. So, C tier. Next up is neglecting QA. Now, I used to work for a major company as a QA tester and as a game balance aide. If you are new to game dev, especially if you are an indie game dev, you have to understand that QA is not the same as playing the game. And QA testers are usually people with a bit of understanding of game dev and coding. And let me tell you, we will find bugs in your game. Your code is not as good as you think it is. I see so many bugs in games being released these days. It's very obvious to me when a game has neglected QA. It might not be obvious to random gamers, and so for that reason, I'm gonna be really, really generous and give this a C tier. But seriously, it sticks out like a sore thumb. Trust me on this. If you have not extensively QA'd your game has bugs. It's not as bad these days because because you can somewhat rely on game engines, and a lot of them are pretty stable compared to back in the day. But still, trust me, if you neglect QA, your game has bugs. And I mean thousands of them. And last but definitely not least, lecturing gamers. And yes, that is once again using Dragon Age Veilguard as an example. Now, there's a right way to include philosophy and morality in your game, and a wrong way to do it. The simple example of the right way to do it is to look at Metal Gear Solid. There's a lot of moral questions that Metal Gear Solid poses. There's a lot of philosophical questions about murder and torture and whether or not you can really blame somebody for being what they are considering their circumstances. But you know what Metal Gear Solid never does? Is it never tells you what it thinks right and wrong is. At no point in its script does it not allow the player to think for themselves. It introduces characters of questionable morality from certain backgrounds and lets the player decide. This is a critical thing that I think woketoids don't understand. Because I see these midwits, especially all over the place on Reddit, saying that, oh, gaming was always philosophical, it was always political. And you know what? They're to some degree right. Ever since, I'd say, the Super Nintendo days, games have had a little bit of philosophy in them. That's around the time when we started seeing more storytelling, and that's where we started to see occasional games bringing up the occasional, moral quandary. And I swear these people really just do not seem to understand that there's a very big difference between telling a story and being preachy. When you are outright lecturing the player about pronouns, the writer dev is no longer telling a story. They're injecting their crappy politics into the game and trying to tell players that they're wrong if they disagree. Regardless of what they're preaching, this is always a sign of amateur writing. However, I will just barely spare this one from Pit of Hell tier, simply because it's easy for an amateur writer to accidentally make this mistake. But to the devs doing it on purpose, absolute Pit of Hell tier. And anyways, that's about wraps it up. I hope you gamers out there enjoyed this as just kind of a cathartic takedown of a lot of the crap we're currently seeing in the industry. And hopefully any current devs or future aspiring devs, especially indie devs, will take what I've said to heart. Because I guarantee you I am not the only one who has noticed. Anyways, that is all. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, share, comment, subscribe, and all that good algorithm stuff. And if you want to support my content, you can do so on Subscribestar, becoming a member of the channel, Ko-Fi, or by just buying some merch, which again, there is a new merch sale, and that'll be in the description below. Thanks again for watching. Till next time.